Today at the Nebraska state capitol after a state senator included the names of two other senators who are siblings while reading passages from a book depicting sexual assaults.
Senator Steve Halloran defended his actions, and as 6 News' Joe Harris tells us, not everyone thinks he should be reprimanded.
I know that the speech on this floor is protected speech, but it is misguided to think that there is a same thing between appropriate speech and protected speech.
At the state capitol Tuesday, frustration, disgust, and calls for accountability.
They still have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are the harm that your speech causes.
State senators stepped up to the mic to talk about the speech that grabbed national attention overnight. While debating a bill Monday about keeping obscenity out of schools, Senator Steve Halloran read a graphic rape scene from a novel, inserting John and Machaela Cavanaugh's names to make a point.
That's language that should not be in front of children. I'm sorry I had to read it.
Halloran apologized Tuesday, not for reading the transcript, but for including the Cavanaugh's names.
It was a hard thing to read. And no, I was not trivializing rape. I was reading from a book that's required reading for some students. Should I have interjected the senators' names? No. Sometimes we do things on the floor in the midst of making a statement that we shouldn't have done.
He also tried to clarify his actions, saying the Cavanaughs were distracted while he was reading and that he wanted to get their attention, something he now says he shouldn't have done. Machaela Cavanaugh isn't buying it.
And yesterday before the dinner break, Senator Halloran came up to myself and Senator Walls and started telling us what was in that passage that he read into the microphone. He started describing it to us. So when he says that this wasn't directed at me, even though he did invoke my name at the start of his remarks before he invoked my brother's name, and then he dropped the first name, when he says it wasn't directed at me, I don't believe him.
John Cavanaugh says Halloran is not seeing the harm he caused to everyone else.
What you did in this conversation about obscenity and prurient interests is took a story and inserted your colleagues into it for effect, which in itself you created a new work, one that is far more prurient than the original content you were discussing, because you, in essence, sexualized the people you work with.
Criticism also came from Halloran's fellow Republicans. Senator Julie Slama questioned whether someone would still have their job if they did what Halloran did in any other workplace.
We're the most public workplace in this state, and we deserve for it to be a professional workplace. Senator Halloran, you should be ashamed of yourself for being incapable of apologizing. There is no justification for your actions, and you should resign.
Halloran did get a measure of support from the other side of the aisle. Democratic Senator Danielle Conrad says the state's constitution ensures the highest protections for legislator speech, and that lawmakers should not support calls for censoring or expelling Halloran.
It is wrong to invoke governmental punishments for speech that we find offensive.
Regardless of their position, Democratic and Republican senators agree Halloran needs to do better with his apology. On your side, Joe Harris, 6 News.
Speaker John Arch says while he doesn't want senators to simply move on from yesterday's incident, he also doesn't want it to derail the session, pointing out that the legislature is only halfway through debating priority bills.